As Colombia reaches the 37th day of national strike mobilizations against the government of Iván Duque, citizens are insisting on the negotiation of emergency petitions and also warranties for the exercise of the right to protest. Perus candidates in Sunday's runoff presidential ballot concluded their electoral campaigns this Thursday. The UN's humanitarian coordinator in the Democratic Republic of the Congo warned of the urgent need of assistance as millions face food insecurity and called for more funding to address the crisis. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Gladys Quesada. And now we begin with the news. As Colombia reaches the 37th day of national strike mobilizations against the government of Iván Duque, citizens are insisting on the negotiation of the emergency petitions presented by the protest movement and warranties for the exercise of the right to protest. Uncertainty regarding the possibility of an end to the nationwide mobilization continues due to the government's refusal to abide by the Memorandum of Understanding previously reached with the National Strike Committee in order to overcome a stalemate at the negotiating table. The Strike Committee demonstrated once again its willingness to continue the dialogue process by gradually dismantling some of the roadblocks set up in several parts of the country. However, the government continues to issue new demands, while the violent repression by state security forces continues. The International Mission of Solidarity and Human Rights Observation to Colombia offered a preliminary report this Thursday on the conclusions of the verification visit it has been carrying out in the South American country since May 25th. The report details the state repression against protesters taking part in the national strike mobilizations that the country has been experiencing for more than a month. Spokesperson of the international mission pointed out that there is a media blackout that prevents the world from seeing what the government of Iván Duque is doing, which they described as a massacre. They stressed that they did not allow themselves to be carried away by information that they could not verify, and for this reason they spread throughout Colombia to gather their own testimonies and figures. They further stated that based on the actions taken by the security forces, an investigation should be carried out against the Colombian state for human rights violations. The international mission highlighted the revictimization and criminalization to which demonstrators are subjected after having been attacked by the security forces.
Revictimization are notorious, and the victim is usually investigated and criminalized before the attacker. Prosecutors control the hospitals not to inform the victim of his or her rights, but now prosecute and criminalize them according to the incident in which he or she was injured.
In Mexico, the three-day pre-election silence has begun prior to the midterm elections to be held this Sunday. As announced by the electoral authority as of this Thursday, campaigning by any means, the publication of polls and electoral propaganda of any kind are banned. Close to 93.5 million voters are called to the polls on Sunday to elect 500 members of the Chamber of Deputies, 15 out of 32 state governors, 30 local legislatures, and over 1,900 municipal presidencies. The election campaign has seen the assassination of more than 30 candidates as organized criminal gangs seek to protect their interest and scare voters away from the polls. An Uruguayan court imprisoned 7 former military officers for crimes against humanity this Thursday. 3 of them had already served sentence for similar crimes during the military dictatorship that ruled the South American nation between 1973 and 1985. The 4 retired officers were charged with deprivation of liberty and private violence against some 30 detainees in the clandestine torture center 300 Carlos, which operated between 1975 and 1977 in a military facility in Montevideo, Uruguay's capital. The prosecutor's special office for crimes against humanity is still investigating other 50 suspects of crimes linked to state terror. And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back. Perus candidates in the runoff presidential ballot concluded their electoral campaigns on Thursday. The vote will be held this coming Sunday, June the 6th. Left-winger Pedro Castillo, slightly ahead in opinion polls, delivered a plan to fight the coronavirus pandemic and strengthen the country's public health system to the Dean of Peru's nurses guild, Liliana La Rosa, in the country's capital, Lima. Meanwhile, his opponent, Keiko Fujimori, representing corporate and right-wing interests, visited a different branch of the same guild. Both candidates' campaign teams had chosen the central San Martin Square in Lima for their closing rallies Thursday evening. However, the government decided at the last minute to fence off the venue to avoid confrontations. The crisis in Peru's public education system is one of the key issues to be addressed by the new administration resulting from this coming Sunday's second round of presidential elections. In constant decline for the past 3 decades, the pandemic has dealt the sector a final blow. Presidential candidates Pedro Castillo and Keiko Fujimori have offered to double the education budget, but without saying how or when that will be done. More with our correspondent, Veronica Insausti.
The second school year with online education, but only 39% homes nationwide have internet and 34% have a computer, while in rural areas only 6% of the population have access to these services, according to information from the Ombudsman Office. These deficiencies added to a collapsed infrastructure and a deficit of 50% in teachers' hiring.
Historically, politicians have no interest in solving the education problem. Why should they have it now? I wish it were so, but it must also be said that education in Peru is one more reason for people to feel that social distance, because there are good schools in Peru, of course, like Newton, which costs $1,000 a month and $18,000 as entrance fee. If you have that kind of money, you can get a good education. That is for a minority. The vast majority in Peru do not have access to a decent education.
During the last 3 decades and progressively, the state have been handing over to private companies the responsibility of guaranteeing access to education. Only 38% of public schools nationwide have potable water, and in the last 8 years they have destroyed public employment in the teaching profession, reducing the number of appointed teachers from 330,000 to 148,000.
Stop privatizing. Both Castillo and Veronica Mendoza agreed that they had to reverse the negative tendency of appointing teachers and start appointing at least 50,000 teachers every year.
With a deficit in human resources and the vast majority of schools in a state of emergency declared by the Ministry of Education itself, the state assigns a large percentage of its annual budget to sponsoring private education and exonerating them from paying taxes.
What does the state have to do financing private universities and this destruction of teachers' jobs, of which Castillo has also been a victim himself? That should end. And we should return to having a public education service of appointed teachers and make a significant investment in basic education, not disinvest as these gentlemen pretend to do. Under the pretext that they are reforming the service, they are actually privatizing it.
Presidential candidates Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo have promised to double the budget assigned to the sector, which today is 4% of the gross domestic product, an increase that has been in waiting for 50 years, when in the framework of the so-called national agreement. All political parties committed to increase education funding. Veronica Insausti, TeleSUR Peru.
Veronica Insausti, TeleSUR Peru.
The Russian Ministry of Finance announced it will introduce changes to the structure of the National Wealth Fund to abandon US dollar assets completely. Speaking during the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which is running through Saturday, the finance minister explained the decision follows of the central bank and will see an increase in the share of euros, yuan and gold instead. He also said that this reduction in dollar assets will happen within a month. The forum is the country's main showcase for investors, attracting political and business leaders from around the world. It comes as Russia continues to battle Western sanctions. In 2020, the inflow of foreign direct investment to Russia slumped off the level of the mid-1990s, the central bank said in January, after years of steadily decreasing against
and government officials are now very fond of kind of stating fairly clearly that bad politics should not be allowed to interfere with good business. The problem is the legacy of the last several years of sanctions as well as the economic downturn. It's going to take quite a lot to persuade foreign investors to come back to Russia or to expand their existing operations in Russia.
Spain's Prime Minister visited the Libyan capital of Tripoli on Thursday to reopen his country's embassy and show support for Libya's new interim authorities. This was the latest trip to the country by the high-level European official. Libyan authorities are seeking to overcome a decade of chaos and conflict that followed the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 after the NATO military intervention in the country.
Forward to taking more of these positive steps, lifting the air ban imposed on Libyan planes and facilitating the granting of visas to Libyans, especially to students studying in Spain in various fields. Memoranda of understanding were signed between the two countries regarding customs, transportation, agriculture, education and diplomatic exchange, as well as between the chambers of commerce of the two countries.
And hundreds of Moroccan men who recently crossed into Spain's North African enclave of Ceuta queued on Thursday to potentially seek asylum and avoid deportation to Morocco. After a massive border breach on May 17th and 18th, the vast majority of crossed who immediately pushed back to Morocco, but hundreds have managed to remain in Ceuta, as well as nearly 1,000 unaccompanied minors. Police handed out appointments for preliminary interviews at the border. Spain has agreements with Morocco to return adult migrants who do not apply for asylum. Still, only a minority of those who are identified for deportation are successfully sent back. The challenge for the adults is not only to be allowed to remain in Ceuta, but find ways to move to mainland Spain, where they hope to find employment. The United Nations Health Agency on Thursday said it had detected a surge late last month in coronavirus cases in Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A DRC Health Ministry official confirmed the third wave of COVID-19 is already there. It's the Indian, Delta, and South African Beta variants. The WHO said that the mortality rate across the country was currently unchanged at 2.5%, but noted concern about the presence of the Delta variant in Kinshasa. However, the daily national figures have risen from several dozens in past weeks to 243 on Thursday. Millions of Algerians living abroad are unable to return to their home country despite the partial reopening of borders. The government began partial reopening of air and land borders on Tuesday, after more than a year of closure due to the pandemic. However, flights are currently very limited and only authorized from France, Spain, Tunisia, and Turkey. Passengers must have a negative PCR test taken 36 hours before flying and have to undergo a 5-day quarantine on arrival at designated hotels, which they must pay for themselves. The health ministry has recorded almost 130,000 cases since the beginning of the pandemic, ranking 9th place in Africa. On Thursday, the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Robert Mardini, said the global body was asking donors for some $10 million as a preliminary appeal to deal with the health crisis in the Gaza Strip, burdened by the COVID-19 pandemic and struggling to recover from the recent attacks of the Israeli occupying regime and ongoing blockade.
On addressing priority needs in Gaza, for which we are asking our donors for an additional budget of 10 million Swiss francs, which is a little bit over $11 million as a preliminary appeal. Some example of what our teams are doing right now on the ground. We have an ICRC surgical team recently arrived in the Gaza Strip, operating in Al-Shifa Hospital, and one of our priorities is to bring in extra medical supplies to support an already fragile health system under immense strain, as you know, which is also simultaneously coping with the spread of COVID-19, which of course is very different in the Gaza Strip than in the rest of Israel and the occupied territory.
And Chile is facing the collapse of its healthcare system due to a lack of hospitals beds to care for COVID-19 patients, officials said. The Deputy Health Secretary warned the country is quickly running out of hospital beds, having gone from using 1,200 to almost 4,500 now. Some 97% of Chile's hospital beds are now filled with severely ill COVID-19 patients, even though 52% of its people have been jabbed with COVID-19 vaccines. In the capital, Santiago, home to 8 of the country's 19 million Chileans, 99% of hospitals' beds are full. Just last week, Chile registered 45,500 new cases of people with COVID-19, with many exhibiting new variants of the virus. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back. The United Nations humanitarian corridor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo warned on Thursday that the country has the largest number of people in urgent need of assistance due to food insecurity and called for more funding to deal with the situation aggravated by the eruption of a volcano in the country's east. Thousands of residents were forced to flee the city of Goma and to seek refuge in other regions of the country and neighboring Rwanda when Mount Nyiragongo spewed torrents of lava into villages last month. According to the UN official, in total more than 5 million people are displaced, fleeing insecurity, violence, and natural disasters. He also stressed that 27.3 million people in the nation of 86 million were acutely food insecure. The UN's humanitarian response plan, which targets almost 10 million residents, has only received 12% of the funding needed. Authorities in Nigeria confirmed that gunmen seized 136 children from an Islamic seminary on Sunday. The Niger state government first reported the raid on the school in the town of Tegina on Monday, but did not announce the number of children seized. Armed gangs have been terrorizing inhabitants in northwest and central Nigeria by looting villages, stealing cattle, and taking people hostage. Gunmen carrying out kidnapping for ransom are responsible for a series of raids on schools and universities in the north of the country in recent months, in which more than 800 students have been abducted since December. In a statement, the government said it has initiated the negotiation to bring the students back safely.
The government, they should try by all possible ways to protect our peoples for us, our children for us. We cannot say anything. They tried with the effort that they made so far, and we are hoping they are going to try harder to bring back our children successfully.
Rising violence in northwestern Nigeria's Zamfara state is stuck in a humanitarian crisis, according to international medical charity Doctors Without Borders. In a statement published on Thursday, the charity said it had already treated over 10,000 children between January and April for severe acute malnutrition, measles, malaria, and other conditions, representing 54% more than in the same period last year. Nearly 700,000 people were internally displaced in northwest and north-central Nigeria in February, including more than 124,000 in Zamfara alone, according to the UN Migration Agency. The authorities are struggling to respond in a region that has already recorded the highest poverty rate in Nigeria, the international crisis group think tank said in a report. Thousands took to the streets of Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on Thursday, stepping up their demands for justice for protesters killed during a crackdown on anti-government demonstrations 2 years ago. Ahead of Thursday's protest, Sudanese authorities had closed off the main roads leading to the army headquarters in Khartoum and urged demonstrators to stay away from the site. Protesters rallied to mark the second anniversary of a violent dispersal of a protest camp set out outside the military headquarters on June 3, 2019, and others elsewhere in the country just weeks after the military overthrew President Omar al-Bashir after months of protest. The raid on the camp killed at least 128 people, according to activists, with families of the victims still waiting for justice.
To the streets against Bashir, and now I am against this government I helped take power, and I was imprisoned and flogged during the last revolution. The first message for the families of the martyrs who died is that they are not only our sons, they are also our brothers. Don't expect justice from this current civil and military government.
All of them, they only think about themselves. We are the ones who brought them to power, and they failed to bring justice to the martyrs, bring them justice to shoot our hearts.
And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.